If you have a Bible this morning, I want to invite you to turn with me to Luke chapter 1. If you have a Bible, if you brought one with you, or if you need to use one in the chair or the pew in front of you, Luke chapter 1 is where we're going to be as we begin this Advent season. So we've kind of mentioned a couple of times that this is the first Sunday in December. It's also the first Sunday of Advent. And I just want to take a little time as we begin to talk with you a little bit about what the season of Advent is all about. Maybe the idea of Advent is a new thing for you. Maybe you could just use a refresher. So the word Advent literally means the coming or the arrival of a notable person or event. So Advent really means the arrival. And so over the last couple of thousand years, the church has historically used this time in December, the Sundays leading up to Christmas, as a season of Advent. And what they've done during the season is that they've focused on the first advent of Jesus. They've looked back and celebrated the fact that Jesus has come, but they've also turned their attention forward to the fact that one day Jesus will return. During the Advent season, the church has often both looked back and looked forward. So what I've often heard it said and what I've often repeated is that Advent is a season for both celebration and anticipation. There's kind of naturally in the Christmas season celebration that we get to be excited about being together with family and friends and celebrating together. There is this celebration that happens as we remember the fact that Jesus has come. His first advent has already happened. But yet, I think the season also so often raises up in us some anticipation. Kids often, count down the days until Christmas morning. So often we wait for school to be over or work to be over for us to be able to go on that vacation or that trip. So often the season has within it a feeling of anticipation. And this has been what the church has focused on throughout its history. And this is what's really drawn my heart to the Advent season and probably some more of my kind of recent years. So I was raised in a church, but I wasn't raised in a church that really did what we called Advent. We really just focused on Christmas. This was a good Bible-believing, gospel-preaching church, and we were really good, I think, about making sure that Jesus was the reason for the season, and we kept Christ in Christmas and all those good things. But what I really found was that it was a season really of only looking back. That it was really all kind of about Jesus' birth and the baby in the manger. And while that was such good news, I often found that it kind of left me longing for something more, that as Christmas Day came, often kind of that sense of anticipation kind of left as Christmas Day came and went. And I came to find that the season of Advent, when approached in this way with a dual focus of both looking back and looking forward, gives us a fuller and I think richer experience of this season. To be reminded that the sense of anticipation doesn't end on Christmas morning, but rather we continue to long for Jesus to come again. That as we look back and we celebrate, we are given a firm foundation for our faith, and we are given a hope, but it is a hope that pushes us to long forward for when Jesus will return. Jesus' first coming and his second coming will be our focus throughout this Advent season. And that is good news. The fact that Jesus has come and that he will one day come again. And in this particular Advent season, I want us to focus on how we receive this good news. This good news that Jesus has come, it is the message of the Advent season. Advent isn't primarily about a good idea or a good belief system. It is good news. Child has been born, and he is Christ the Lord. Our hope for Jesus' return is built upon this historical reality, this good news. Something has happened. We have this good news, but so often I think it becomes very familiar news to us. Whether you grew up in church or you've just kind of been around the Christian message, even if you just live in America, most likely you know something about what the Christmas season is all about and its Christian roots. You know something about the birth of Jesus and the angels and the shepherds and the nativity scene. And so many times I think because this is a familiar message to us, we don't always hear the good news. We listen to it, we kind of know it, but we don't always truly reflect on it. We don't always truly maybe receive it as we should. And so for some people, maybe this will be the first time that you really consider what the good news of the Christmas season is all about. what the good news of the Advent season is all about. But maybe for many of us, it will be one of many times that you've heard this, but my hope is that we would receive it afresh. That we would remember that it's not just about a story of something that happened a couple of thousand years ago, but it is something that still makes a difference in our lives. It's something that still gives us hope for the future. So the way that we're going to approach it throughout this series is we're going to consider some of those people who first received the good news around this kind of Christmas story. We're going to look at the gospel accounts as to those who first heard the good news and how did they receive it? How did they respond to it? And my hope is that this would lead us to receive the good news and to respond to it as the Lord would lead. And so we begin today in Luke chapter 1 with a man named Zechariah. One of the first people of the kind of Christmas story to receive good news. And I want us to consider how he received it and how he responded. Luke chapter 1, starting in verse 5, and I'll read through verse 25. Luke writes that in the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah of the division of Abijah. And he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. But they had no child, because Elizabeth was barren, and both were advanced in years. Now, while he was serving as priest before God when his division was on duty, according to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And the whole multitude of the people were praying outside at the hour of incense. And there appeared to him an angel of the Lord standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And Zechariah was troubled when he saw him, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John. And you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great before the Lord. And he must not drink wine or strong drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from his mother's womb. And he will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God. He will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord a people prepared." And Zechariah said to the angel, "How shall I know this? For I am an old man, and my wife is advanced in years." And the angel said to him, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you and bring you this good news. And behold, you will be silent and unable to speak until the day that these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time." And the people were waiting for Zechariah, and they were wondering at his delay in the temple. And when he came out, he was unable to speak to them. And they realized he had seen a vision in the temple. And he kept making signs to them and remained mute. And when his time of service was ended, he went to his home. After these days, his wife Elizabeth conceived. For 5 months, she kept herself hidden, saying, "Thus the Lord has done for me in the days when he looked on me, to take away my reproach among people." There's a number of stories in the Bible that are really similar to this one, in the sense that there was a couple who was advanced in years, as the text says, or we just say they were old, and they were without children. They had been barren, and God intervened in a miraculous way to give them a child. We heard earlier of the story of Hannah and how God blessed her with her son Samuel. Probably know the story of Abraham, who was the father of Israel. He and his wife Sarah were old and beyond the years of childbearing, but God miraculously gave them a son. Maybe a little lesser known is the story of Samson, how his parents were unable to have a child, but yet the angel of the Lord visited them and told them they were going to have a son. There's some things that all these stories have in common. All of these births were important in the story of redemption that God was writing. We find here that John's birth is one that is very important in this story. John is here as a forerunner of Jesus. When we talk about the good news of Christmas, we're talking about the fact that the Son of God and the Lamb of God, as we said earlier, has come. And John was the one who was going to prepare the way for him. As Gabriel says here, many were going to rejoice at the birth of this child. because he was coming in the spirit of Elijah as a prophet of God to prepare the way of the Lord. He was going to turn disobedient people back to the Lord. He was going to prepare the way for the Messiah to come. There's something kind of in common with these stories, but there's something unique about this story here. As Zechariah has this interaction with Gabriel, he is quite literally left speechless. Like after he receives this good news from the angel, he cannot speak because he does not receive this good news in the way that God had intended. There is something within him that causes him to disbelieve or to have doubt as he receives this good news. Well, this morning, I want to turn our focus not so much to the good news that John was going to be born. Well, it's very important good news, and we're going to turn our attention to the good news of this season in the coming weeks. But today I want to turn our attention actually to this interaction that Zechariah has with Gabriel, because I think it teaches us something about the way that we must receive the good news. And so I want to offer you this morning 4 lessons from Zechariah in this interaction that he has with this angel and this very important conversation as he receives the good news. The first lesson I think we can learn from Zechariah was that we need to be aware of the impact of difficult circumstances. One lesson I think we can learn from Zechariah's life, and particularly this story as he receives the good news from the angel Gabriel, is that difficult circumstances in our lives will have an impact on us. So many times, the way that we receive the good news that God has to offer us will be impacted by what is going on in our lives. So many times it might be challenging to trust the promises of God or to receive the good news from God when we are facing difficult circumstances. I want you just to consider for a moment the circumstances, the season that Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth were facing. So you go back to verse 6 at the beginning of the story. Luke tells us that both Zechariah and Elizabeth, they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. But they had no child because Elizabeth was barren and both were advanced in years. Now, I kind of find it interesting. If you pay attention to those 2 verses, I kind of find it interesting that verse 7 begins with a but. Did you notice that as Luke introduces us to Zechariah and Elizabeth, he says that they were both godly people. They walked in righteousness. They obeyed the commandments of the Lord. And then he says, but they didn't have a child. I think what's interesting there is that Luke, as he tells his story, is almost presenting contrasting realities. That these were godly people, yet on the other hand, they did not have any children. I think if most of us in our culture were kind of thinking about this story, we might just use an and. This was a godly couple walking with the Lord, doing what he told them to do, and they did not have any children. For us, these might just be both kind of coexisting realities, but in this culture, these were often contrasting realities. You see, to not have children in this culture was a shameful thing. Usually when a woman could not have children, when she was barren, it was often viewed as some type of discipline or punishment even maybe from God. You'll notice that at the end of this story, whenever Elizabeth realizes she has conceived, she talks about the way that the Lord has visited her, looked upon her, and he has taken away her reproach among the people. It's clear that Elizabeth and Zechariah, while godly people, were living in some type of reproach among people. People probably often looked at Zechariah and Elizabeth and said, you know, they seem like such godly people. He is a priest. She comes from the line of Aaron. I mean, it seems like they're doing everything right, but don't you know they don't have any kids? I wonder what they've done in their past. I wonder what sin they've been holding on to. I wonder why God has not blessed them with any children. It seems like Zechariah and Elizabeth probably were living in some type of not just challenging, but a difficult circumstance in the way that people would view them and think about them and speak about them. Maybe in some way you could even relate to them. Maybe there's been times in your life when you've faced challenging circumstances. Maybe times in your life when you've had situations that were outside of your control, yet it brought shame or judgment upon you from others. Here you have Zechariah and Elizabeth in this difficult time, and it obviously, I think, affects or it impacts the way that Zechariah receives this message from the angel. Because notice what Zechariah says in verse 18. After the angel speaks to him about this good news, that he's going to have a child and all that this child will do, Zechariah says to the angel, "How shall I know this? For I am an old man and my wife is advanced in years." Zechariah here, he is kind of wise because he refers to himself as old, but he just refers to his wife as advanced in years, right? He's careful not to call Elizabeth old. But you notice here that this season of his life, or the circumstances that are in his life, make it hard for him to receive this good news. I mean, the angel has just given him perhaps the best news that he could hear. His prayer has been answered. They're going to have a son. This son is not just going to be any child, but he's going to be great before the Lord, filled with the Spirit, used by God to do a mighty work. Zechariah's first response is, "But how can I know this? I'm old and my wife is old." In these moments, it seems like Zechariah couldn't see beyond his circumstances. The challenging season of his life was preventing him from really receiving the good news as God had intended. And so often that can happen for us. I mean, maybe you've been here and you've been praying for something that God has not yet answered, at least in the way that you had hoped. Maybe you've been praying for healing in your life or in the life of a loved one, and God has not yet answered, and it causes you to question at times, does God really care about me? Does he really hear my prayers? Does he really answer my prayers? Maybe you come into this holiday season not really excited or full of joy, but maybe you come bearing a great burden. Maybe as you enter into this holiday season, it will be the first holiday season without a loved one. Maybe you walk towards Christmas with a sense of grief and pain, and you start to wonder, is all this Christmas story really even true? Does it even really matter? Does it make a difference in my life? Perhaps if you're ever looking around the world and you see the problems in our world, wars that are being fought, injustices that are happening, you sometimes might wonder, does God really care about what's happening in the world? Is Jesus really going to come back? Is he going to really make all things new and right every wrong? There's so many times when we're in difficult seasons, it can impact our faith. It can impact the way we receive the good news. Now, it doesn't always mean it's a negative impact. In fact, so many times in the Bible, it speaks about the way that trials and difficult seasons are actually used by God to strengthen our faith. So many times in the Bible, the difficult seasons of life are referred to as a fire that is used to purify and test our faith. Doesn't always mean that there is a negative outcome. In fact, I think even in Zechariah's life, we'll see his faith strengthened. But what I don't want us to do is be unaware of the fact that difficult seasons will impact the way that we receive the good news, the way that we trust the promises of God. It's good for us to be aware of this. This is the first lesson that I think we learn from Zechariah. The second lesson that I think we learn from Zechariah is that we need to be slow to demand evidence. When we think about receiving the good news of God, from God, the good news of Jesus Christ coming into the world, the good news of the promises of God, including Jesus' return, I think we need to be slow to demand evidence. You know, when you first read this story, you kind of almost feel bad for Zechariah. Like, he seemed to just ask like a pretty harmless question, right? How shall I know this? And yet he can't talk for 9 months. I mean, I don't know if you've ever had those places in the Bible that you read and you feel like the punishment doesn't really fit the crime. Like, is this just Gabriel just kind of overreacting to the fact that Zechariah questioned him in this message? Why does this question by Zechariah really spark such a response from Gabriel? In fact, I think it becomes really interesting. Next week, we're going to look at the latter part of chapter 1, and we're going to see how Gabriel also came to Mary, gave her a message of good news. And we'll notice the next week that Mary actually also responds with a question. But the question seems to come from a different heart posture, a different motivation. She receives it in faith, but it seems pretty clear here that Zechariah's question is not merely a question, but it seems to come from a position of really demanding some type of sign or evidence from the Lord. Notice how Gabriel responds to what Zechariah requests when he says, how shall I know this? It says in verse 19, the angel said to him, I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I was sent to speak to you, to bring you this good news. And behold, you will be silent and unable to speak until the day that these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their time. You see, Gabriel's response lets us know that there was something going on in Zechariah as he asked this question. He's not just asking for some type of clarification. His question about how shall I know this comes from a place of unbelief or of doubt. Gabriel says, because you did not believe my words, you will be silent. Now, what's kind of interesting here is that it seems like Zechariah is requesting some type of evidence or sign, and God actually gives him a sign. The sign that Zechariah receives is that he won't be able to speak for 9 months. I mean, this is a sign that this is going to take place. It says that when he left the temple that day, people could tell that he had seen a vision because he couldn't speak to them. God gives Zechariah a sign right here, but the sign is also a form of discipline. That throughout the whole pregnancy, Zechariah would not be able to speak because he had demanded some type of sign or evidence to believe this good news. You have to wonder, well, what's so wrong about asking for some sign? What's so wrong about kind of demanding some evidence that we might be able to trust what the message that we are hearing? Well, I think Jesus speaks to this later in his ministry. You know, when Jesus was on the earth and he was doing his ministry, there were other people that made similar requests to Zechariah. People who would come to Jesus and demand to see signs. Luke writes about this just a little bit later in his gospel. In Luke chapter 11, it talks about how Jesus was interacting with a whole group of people. And it says in verse 16, there were others wanting to test him. They kept seeking from him a sign from heaven. Jesus has this interaction with him, and it eventually leads him in verse 29 to say this. When the crowds were increasing, he began to say, this generation is an evil generation. It seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. It's kind of interesting. Jesus says that those who are seeking a sign are part of an evil generation. Now, again, what's so evil about asking for a sign or asking for evidence to be able to trust or believe this good news? Well, I think the key is back up in verse 16 of Luke chapter 11. It said that the people were seeking a sign because they wanted to test him. You know, that same language of wanting to test Jesus is the word that is used earlier in Luke's gospel when it speaks about the devil testing or tempting Jesus in the wilderness. This testing of Jesus or this testing of God did not come from a place of just seeking clarification or hoping to grow in their faith. This was really seeking to put the Lord to the test, to put yourself in a position above God, to saying, God, you need to prove yourself to me. This is what it means, I think, to demand evidence in this negative way. It is really seeking to test God to see whether or not he is trustworthy. But the really problem in all this is that God has already proven himself trustworthy. I mean, it's so ironic, isn't it, that Jesus is getting these requests from people that they might see a sign when all of Jesus' ministry was giving them signs. I mean, they come to him asking for a sign from heaven when Jesus has been healing people and feeding people. Jesus has been raising people from the dead. He has revealed himself. And you think about even in Zechariah's story. I mean, there he is all by himself before the altar, and there appears before him an angel. It says he knew it was an angel. He was filled with fear. What more evidence does Zechariah need? Jesus says in his response to this evil generation, there will only be one true sign given, and that is the sign of Jonah. What he means is just as Jonah was in the great fish for 3 days and then came out, the same way Jesus would go into the grave for 3 days and then emerge from the grave. Jesus' sign of who he truly is would be sealed in his death and resurrection. You see, the problem is not having evidence for our faith. This is why I tried to word this lesson as let's be slow to demand evidence. Because I don't think the Bible ever calls us to have no evidence for what we believe. I don't think God actually ever calls us to just a blind faith with no foundation for why we believe what we believe. Again, Jesus came into this world to reveal God to us. He performed these miracles so that we might know he truly is the Son of God. He not only lived on this earth, but he also died a very public death. And then he gave us the sign of Jonah. He was buried, and 3 days later, he emerged from the grave and appeared to hundreds of witnesses. The problem isn't that God has not given us evidence. The problem is people do not receive the good news by faith, but rather they put themselves in a position to test God. Instead of coming before the Lord and saying that he is trustworthy, they ask God to prove themselves to them. That God is the one who has to show himself to be trustworthy. And this, I think, was Zechariah's problem. That as he has all this evidence before him of God speaking to him, of good news coming to him, he cannot receive it with faith. We need to be slow to demand evidence, not because there's not evidence for our faith, but just the opposite. Because God has already revealed himself to us. Because God has already proven himself trustworthy. Because Jesus has come into this world. Because he has died and risen from the dead, we can have hope. We can be sure that he is coming again. We should not seek more evidence from him. We should trust the good news that he has given us. Now, these first two lessons, I think, come from more of a kind of a negative look, if you will. Kind of the mistake that Zechariah made, if you will. The doubt that arose in his heart or the unbelief that was there. Those are two lessons that I want to give you in a little bit more of a positive direction that I think we can learn from this interaction with Zechariah and Gabriel. The third lesson, and one that's more in a positive direction, I think, is that we need to recognize that doubt can arise in faithful people. One thing that we need to be sure of as we consider this is that doubt can arise even in faithful people. I mean, when we are introduced to Zechariah and Elizabeth in this story, we recognize that their whole life was not marked by doubt. The whole life was not marked by unbelief. They were people who lived godly lives. Again, go back to verse 6. They were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord. Zechariah and Elizabeth were people that you would look up to. I mean, he was a priest chosen by Lot to go into the altar. That was a significant duty. People are outside praying for him because of what he's been chosen to do. They are godly, faithful people. Elizabeth shows herself throughout the story to be a godly, faithful person. These were wise people in the church that you would go to for advice. And yet, in this moment, this interaction, Zechariah expresses doubt. He has a question, comes from a place of unbelief. But it's true that it wasn't marking his life before this, and I don't think it marks his life after this. You go to the end of the story. After Elizabeth has had the baby, John is delivered, and the people come. It says in verse 59, on the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child. And they, meaning the people, would have called him Zechariah after his father. But his mother answered, no, he shall be called John. And they said to her, none of your relatives is called by this name. And they made signs to his father, inquiring what he wanted him to be called. And he asked for a writing tablet and wrote, his name is John. And they all wondered. And immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue loosed, and he spoke, blessing God. Zechariah and Elizabeth are both obedient to God throughout this process, even to the naming of their child, which was a significant event in their culture. For them to go with God's direction, God's command to name their child John was significant to show their faith in God. And then even as Zechariah is given the ability once again to speak, his first words were to bless and praise God. After being quiet for 9 months, do you think those would be your first words? I mean, this is a faithful man, but yet in this moment, he has a moment of doubt, a moment of questioning. And I just want us to be encouraged this morning to recognize that doubt can arise in faithful people. So many times I think when we have a season of doubting whether or not the Christmas story is true, if it really makes a difference in my life, doubting whether or not God is real, if he's really answering my prayers. So many times we take those doubts and we get discouraged by them. And we think, man, I must just be a terrible Christian. Maybe I'm not reading my Bible enough. Maybe I'm not praying hard enough. Maybe I'm not doing enough good things in the church. We forget that so often throughout the Bible, faithful people express doubt. I mean, Abraham, God promised him a child, and he expressed questions and doubt when he had to wait for the fulfillment of this promise. Moses had questions and doubt about how God was going to use him to lead the people out of Egypt. Elijah had seen God do this tremendous miracle to prove his realness over the false gods of Baal. And yet, in the following moments, he has questions and doubts. David, King David, anointed by God, used by God to do mighty things, had doubts. In fact, you can read about some of his doubts in the Psalms when he says things to the Lord like, "How long, O Lord? Why have you forsaken me, God?" It's pretty clear that in the Bible that just because doubts arise, questions arise, it does not mean we are people who don't have any faith. Don't be discouraged if a doubt rises up in your mind. Don't also be comfortable in that place of doubt. I think those doubts should drive us to seeking God more. I think it is good for us to read those Psalms of lament or those Psalms being expressed by David saying, "How long, O Lord? Why have you forsaken me, God?" Because it shows us what are we to do with our doubts. We are to take them to God. If you have questions this morning, if you have doubts, I pray that it would lead you to pursue the Lord even more. I pray that it would lead you to share those doubts and questions with the people of God. I always hope that our church should be a safe place for people to ask questions, to express their concerns and their doubts. Because doubts arise even in faithful people. But the difference is, what do our doubts lead us to? For Zechariah, just as a difficult season can have a negative impact, it can also end up having a positive impact. Just as doubts can lead some people to stray and disbelieve, it can also strengthen our faith. It can lead us to pursue God more, to depend upon him more, to have a closer relationship with him. And so often I think that happens when we take the time to actually reflect on the things that we are doubting, to actually reflect on God and his word. So the last lesson I want to give you from Zechariah's story is that times of reflection can pay dividends. Times of reflection can pay dividends. Now, I'll just say right off the bat, I really liked my alliteration with the D words, and so that's why I chose the word dividends. But I do think it's an important lesson. I do think it's not the main lesson of the story, if you will. So sometimes I think when you're preaching the Bible, when you're even just studying the Bible on your own, you have to be careful how you make application. And sometimes we could take stories and we could say, well, this is the way it should always be. We could take a descriptive text and make it prescriptive in our lives. And I'm not saying that's how it always should be. I'm not saying we should look at Zechariah's story and say, anytime we have doubts, we need to take a 9-month vow of silence and that'll be the cure to our problems. But I do think it's kind of interesting, the discipline that God gives Zechariah in this story. I mean, why does he choose to make Zechariah mute? Why does he take away the ability for him to speak? I don't know, maybe it was because Zechariah was too quick to speak in his response to Gabriel. Maybe there was some other reason that God had in mind. But you have to think this really impacted Zechariah's life for this next year or so. I mean, this was a time before texting and emailing. It wasn't just easy for Zechariah to get the written word out there. As he comes out of the temple, he is seeking to make signs and communicate in different ways. And it's pretty obvious, I think, that people have trouble understanding him. Even in that moment when John is born, he asks for a writing tablet. But just knowing the culture and the time that he's in, I don't think he used the writing tablet a lot. I think that during this season, Zechariah probably spent a lot of time thinking. He probably spent a lot of time in silence, in reflection. Perhaps thinking about that good news that the angel had shared with him. Thinking about who this child would be, the role that he would play, how many would rejoice at his birth, how he would turn many hearts back. Perhaps he reflected on the way that he responded and received this good news. But I think times of reflection can really be helpful for us. You know, sometimes whenever our house gets a little chaotic or our car gets a little chaotic, as it does with 3 young children, sometimes I'll challenge my boys, hey, let's play the quiet game. I don't know if you've ever played this game before. We play the quiet game sometimes because I need to use their competitiveness and their desire to beat one another to bring some silence into our house or to our car ride. Because sometimes I just can't think with all the talking and all the questions and all the noise, and we just need to be quiet for a minute. Because I do think sometimes silence, sometimes reflection can be really helpful. It can pay dividends in the way that we receive the good news, the way we believe the good news. And I bring up this point of application because I just have a guess that perhaps this Advent season is maybe one of the least quiet times of the year for you. Maybe when you just look at your calendar leading up to Christmas Day, do you even have an empty moment? With all the end of year deadlines at work, with finals at school, with parties and gatherings, with times with family and friends, with travel and vacations, do you have in that time any moments for silence? Any moments for reflection? I'm afraid sometimes we get so busy during the season that we don't give ourselves a chance to really receive this good news. This is why we've provided Advent devotionals for you. Ones for families with kids or youth that you can pick up in the Next Steps area if you haven't already. Because we want to give families a moment to reflect. This is why you'll get an email each morning if you receive our newsletter, our Advent devotions. With just a brief chance for you to read the Word and reflect on the Word. Because we really believe that these moments can be impactful, even if it's just for a few minutes a day. Would you take some time during the season to intentionally set aside for silence, for reflection? Just take a moment and receive this good news. Maybe that'd be a great way to end our time in the Word this morning. Just take a moment and reflect on this good news. Think about the good news that a holy God loved sinful people. That he loved us so much and was filled with so much mercy that he sent his Son to dwell with us and to die for us. How good is that news? Maybe we'll take a moment just here to reflect on the good news that God does miracles. That he gives children to couples that are old and have been barren. He gives children, as we'll see next week, to young virgins. He heals the sick. He raises the dead. He brings salvation to sinners. He brings light to darkness. How good is that news? And because of what he does, he changes our current reality. He gives us a new identity. In the same way that Elizabeth is able to say, he has visited me, he has looked upon me, he has taken away my reproach among people. This is what God has done for us. Because Jesus came and bore our shame and our reproach. He has now removed our sin and our shame. We are no longer defined by the mistakes that we've made, the sins that we've committed. When we trust in Jesus, we are so united to him, we are clothed in his righteousness. How good is that news?